Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Hamlee. We're broadcasting in front of a live audience at the American Revolution Museum in Yorktown, the place where the story of our nation's foundation is told. The museum is on the New York Times 52 Places to Visit in 2019 list. But Another View is here today to talk about history through a different lens, the lens of Black soldiers who fought for this country in the Revolutionary War and wars beyond. We'll examine the critical but often overlooked roles that Black soldiers played in defense of our country, plus a sneak peek at the brand new exhibit, Forgotten Soldier. Stay tuned for an Another View history lesson live from Yorktown. We'll be right back.
Discussing today's topics from an African American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. You're actually listening to live applause. I'm Barbara Hamlee. We are live at the American Revolution Museum in Yorktown, where the founding of our country comes alive. Welcome, studio audience. We are here today to talk about African Americans and war and the roles of soldiers and so forth. But before we do that, I want to let our listening audience know that last Friday, the Virginia Association of Broadcasters awarded Another View an award for Best News Series for our all-female roundtable. So we are so excited. Yay, yes. It was an exciting night, and we are so excited. And many of our other colleagues at WHRO also won awards, also won Emmys last Saturday night. So we just want to say thank you, because we could not do this work without you all being a part of all of this. So thank you very, very much. So we are here because we're at the American Revolution Museum in Yorktown. It has been included on the New York Times Best 52 Places to Visit in the 2019 list. So everyone wants to come here, and with good reason, because beginning on June 29th, there's a new exhibit called Forgotten Soldier. Now, we have an outstanding panel of guests with us today to unpack the often untold story, the story of Black soldiers in Revolutionary War and wars beyond. Joining me is Catherine Iger Grouper. She's the curator of Forgotten Soldier exhibit. Hello, Kate. How are you?
Hi, well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Harvey Bakari. Harvey, I had listed you first as an African-American history consultant and interpreter, but I think I want to say you're a consultant and interpreter of African-American history.
Correct.
Exactly. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate that. Absolutely. Christy Coleman is the CEO of the American Civil War Museum in Richmond. Hello, Christy.
Hi,
how are
doing?
you? Great. And Dr. Stephanie Richmond is Associate Professor of History at Norfolk State University.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. So I started doing my research on all of these wars and trying to kind of condense a lot of information into a small amount of time. But the one overarching point that I took away from it was that you had throughout, no matter what the war, you had dedicated people, African Americans, who fought for this country at times when this country was not necessarily good to them. Would you agree with that assessment, Harvey? And give us, if you do, let's start by kind of shaping what was going on in America before and during the Revolutionary War.
Well, the Revolutionary War, to just provide the context, most people are familiar with the Civil War, but with the Revolutionary War and General Washington and the Founding Fathers, you have to think back to a time when there were 13 colonies. Each of them was like a country to itself. And for enslaved people and free blacks, for the most of them, there was no way out. There was no way to think that you could end slavery. But when the drums of revolution started to sound, when they could hear their masters saying, "We shall not be slaves to the British," and they could hear it in the northern colonies, the middle colonies, and Virginia was in the middle, was not in the south. And they could hear it in South Carolina. Not only could the gentlemen hear it, but also the enslaved and free black population. So it became contagious. Not to say that slaves weren't thinking of freedom before, but now this was the opportunity. So once the war begins, the enslaved community has an opportunity to make a decision. Everybody's not going to make the same decision. Some slaves ran away and joined the American forces because it was better to be a soldier with a gun than to be a slave. Eventually, they made a law and said, okay, you have to prove that you're a free black to join the military, the patriots. And then countless men, women, children, and elders sought immediate freedom with the British. So it becomes a very complex picture. But we just have to think. I mean, it's easy to hindsight here in the 21st century, but there was just no way out. And that revolution was going to provide a way out. And fighting for the country was going to be a way for free black men to say, I'm a part of this country, I'm born here, this is my land, I'm going to fight for it, I'm going to sacrifice my blood for this country, while others would fight for the British as well.
But Stephanie Richmond, that wasn't necessarily the case, because after the war, they still weren't free, and many of them were returned to slavery, correct?
Correct. The British were not able to hold up their end of the bargain in everyone's case, and particularly here in Yorktown, the British, when they took the formerly enslaved people who come to them to get their freedom with them, they split them into three groups. One went to Nova Scotia, Halifax in Canada. One went to London, and the third group went to the Caribbean. And almost everyone who was taken to the Caribbean was re-enslaved when they arrived there. The groups that were in Nova Scotia and in London, eventually most of them wound up becoming part of Britain's colony in Sierra Leone in West Africa. Some of the people who went to Halifax are actually their descendants still live there today.
Still live there today. So Kate, in the exhibit, Forgotten Soldier, I know that you have the Book of Negroes.
That's correct.
Can you talk about the Book of Negroes and what's in it?
Absolutely, and just picking up of what Stephanie just mentioned, after the Revolution, it's Article 7 of the Treaty of Paris, actually, that calls into question the fate of the African Americans who chose to throw their lots behind the British, take advantage of those opportunities for freedom. Article 7 of the Treaty of Paris stipulated that once the British left North America, they were not to take any property of American inhabitants. And so the way that language was written called into question, does this mean those formerly enslaved African Americans who went behind British lines? So it called into question the lives and liberties of over 3,000 individuals that were waiting in New York to figure out what was going to happen to them next. Basically what ended up happening is George Washington said, hey, we want our property back. Sir Guy Carleton, who was the commander of the British forces at the time, said, no. Not giving these formerly enslaved individuals back to you is not a violation of Article 7 of the treaty. We're not going to do it. There was a compromise that was reached, however, and that resulted in the Book of Negroes and the Inspection Roll of Negroes. What those two documents are is it's a list of the names, the origins, the ages, the backstories, the histories of those 3,000 plus individuals who were able to leave New York with the British. The purpose of that list was essentially to say, well, if there's a time where the British can compensate these American slave owners for the loss of their property, we have the record to be able to do so.
Harvey, if I'm not mistaken, Washington is in the middle of this because he has several of his own slaves from
Actually,
Mount Vernon.
Harry Washington is actually on the list.
Actually on that list. And if I recall, he ends up going to Sierra Leone.
That could be correct.
I think that's right, if I remember correctly.
We can actually go explore that in the Document Explorer that we have in the gallery, which we'll explore here in a little bit. The important thing I wanted to mention, though, is that those two documents have survived from 1783. One of them, the Inspection Roll of Negroes, has always lived at the library. Well, has been in the United States, now in the collection of the library, the National Archives here. But the Book of Negroes actually had a long history for a while, actually at Colonial Williamsburg, but was given back to Queen Elizabeth and lives in the collection of the National Archives at Kew Gardens in London. This exhibition is the first time that those two books have been reunited since 1783, and it's a real pivotal moment for us to be able to display them together.
That is fantastic. And the exhibit goes on until March of 2020, is
March
that correct?
of 2020, so you have plenty of time to come and see those books and explore that Document Explorer. We undertook an incredible amount of research to build hotspots into this Document Explorer where you can read about the lives of these individuals who are mentioned in these documents. Read their names, see their stories.
We saw a film prior to the beginning of this broadcast, and Harvey, I want you to talk to me a little bit about Billy Flora and about his story, because that happened in Great Bridge in Chesapeake. For those that are listening right in Hampton Roads, obviously that's a pivotal area.
Yeah, Flora was, again, a free black. And just to give you a little context of how people may wonder, how did a person become a free black in the 18th century? Well, prior to the American Revolution, most free blacks were the offspring of interracial relationships. According to the law, if your mother's white, your father is black, that child becomes, that mulatto child then, or biracial child then has to serve for their first 18 or 21 years, then they become a free black. So that's where this small free black community is coming from, and they're forming together communities. And someone like Flora, he's doing...
Wait, slow down. You said if the father is black and
Yes.
the mother is white.
Yes.
Interesting, really. I would think it would be more about the slave owner raping the slave as opposed to...
No, there's two sides to the law that began in
Okay.
1662, which says the condition of the mother is the condition of the child.
Right. Okay.
The other part of that law is that if the mother is white, let's say she's an indentured servant or what have not, and the father is black, then that mulatto child, today biracial child, is going to become free after they, for a female, the first 18 years they must serve as an apprentice, as a male, the first 21 years. And during the time, they will learn how to read, how to write as an apprentice, so that they will not become a burden on the public, and they'll be able to create their own communities and be self-sufficient. And so you do have free black communities, and William Flora is one of those men who's protecting his family, and he wants to prove that this is his country. He has to. Free blacks were required to be a part of the militia, as not with muskets, but as drummers, fifers, because they still were a little uneasy with free blacks owning firearms. I mean, they would do it in an emergency, obviously, but he did have his own firearms because there were certain firearm restrictions from free blacks. And so when they attacked, he was going to do what anyone would do when you have property and you feel this is your home, even though it may not completely accept you. It might be an ambiguous home. You're going to protect it. And that's what he did at Great Bridge.
And we have a gentleman in the audience who is from the Sons of Revolution, and you all are actually searching for Billy Flora's gravesite. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. We're trying to find his gravesite. As you know, Billy Flora was a hero of Great Bridge, and I'm a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, and our goal is to honor him for his service at that time. And we would like to be able to properly recognize him by finding his grave and marking it.
And the research that I did, didn't he pass in Philadelphia, or he was in, the last that they saw him, it was in the Philadelphia area? Am I correct in that?
I'm not aware of that.
Not aware of that.
As
Okay.
I understand it, he died 200 years ago this year in Portsmouth.
Okay, all right. And have you gotten, what kind of research, or what are you all doing in terms of trying to search for his gravesite?
We have checked with historians of local churches. We have checked with city historians, with people that are authors of books about that time period. We've looked at court records, looked at his will. We know who his attorney was. We're kind of surprised that he didn't have a mark on his grave, because he owned 4 properties in Portsmouth.
Interesting.
And his will did not list only, there was no son. Some people in Ohio thought that he had a son, but he had a daughter and a wife, and that was it.
And that was it. Okay. As historians, anyone on the panel, are you all familiar or have any idea where he might be?
No. That's the $1,000,000 question.
Absolutely. One thing I want to talk about is the idea, and then we're going to move on to Civil War and then on to some others, because I know we don't have a lot of time today. But for a long time, blacks were, as you said, used as drum majors or other ways other than actually fighting, because there was this fear that once they learned how to fight, that they could come back and turn on the slave owners. So it was really more of a matter of convenience, also not convenience, but of necessity after a lot of the people started dying in the war. Is that correct?
Well, even at the very beginning, it depends. And then just to make a broad statement, most of the black soldiers who fought under arms came from the North, where there was a New England, where there was a smaller black population. So there was less fear of black men with arms. And the South, in Virginia, was 42% black. Or you go to South Carolina, they were like, no, 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 no. We are not putting arms in the hands of men who were slaves yesterday and a soldier today. No. And so they preferred them to do non-combative duty, pioneers, fifers, drummers, but in times of need, they would arm them, or every now and then you might find someone in the artillery. But there was an overwhelming concern that arming blacks soldiers, and think about it, you're a slave one day, you're on the arms the next day, you haven't forgot what happened the day before.
True, very true. And I'm going to come to you in just a minute, Christy, to continue that thread of conversation. But I want to bring in Stephen Seals, who was a guest on our show a couple of weeks ago. He's with Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. But today he is James Lafayette, who was an enslaved person.
Yes. Actually, he was an enslaved individual born in 1748. And actually, I have to thank the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown, because it was their curators, their researchers that helped us to gain so much of this information that I used to interpret every day. But he was an enslaved individual who served under the Marquis de Lafayette, and he spied for him against the British. And upon doing so, you would think through that meritorious service, he might gain his freedom. He has proven that he is useful to the cause, which isn't what happened. He actually ended up through probably a technicality of law is what you would call it. He was actually sent back into slavery and had to fight for at least another 6 years before the legislature finally paid his master the sum of his worth, and he gained his freedom in 1787. So fighting the cause, not gaining it, but eventually finding his freedom, being able to gain his own freedom, having that agency, it's a part of what we interpret when we're trying to,
So when you're doing your interpretation, was he bitter? Was he frustrated? What was the deal?
Guests asked me the question. Actually, they asked me yesterday. One of the guests asked, does he still talk with his old master, William Armistead? And I kind of look at them and I give them that sideways look and I go, no. To be honest, he didn't have a use for me anymore, and I have no use for him. I live in New Kent County, which means that I live a couple of miles away from him, so we're neighbors. I may see him, passing on the road. But other than that, he doesn't seem to need me anymore, so he's not going to talk to me, and I don't really have much need for him. So what reason would I have to necessarily deal with him unless he has something I need, which he does not?
Okay. Thank you so much, Stephen.
I'd love to jump in and comment
Yes,
very
go ahead.
quickly. And Stephen does a great job of interpreting James at Colonial Williamsburg. But we uncovered a lot of research at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown about James's life. He's an important part of our story at Yorktown. For the espionage that he contributed for the Marquis de Lafayette, for George Washington, ultimately which led to the successful victory here of Washington's troops and the surrender of Cornwallis, of course. But Stephen brings up a good point that although James Lafayette, James, who took the name Lafayette later in his life as a thank you to the Marquis de Lafayette, who advocated very strongly for James's personal liberty after the war, James actually never carried a gun. He never enlisted in service. He was not a soldier. And because of that, he was not eligible for manumission that Virginia did declare, would be available to those enslaved or former enslaved individuals. I think that law is 1785?
83.
83, okay. If you carried a gun and if you did serve for the cause of Virginia liberty, then you could claim, you could be manumitted, but James fell through that
Manumitted,
loop.
explain what that means for people
I'm sorry,
who may not know.
that you could be free. It was very I don't think it was unlawful, but it was very difficult at that time in Virginia if you were a slave owner to free your slaves. And this law made it easier to do so if that enslaved individual did serve in the military.
Okay. All right, let's fast forward to the Civil War. We have the expert on the Civil War sitting here with us, the CEO of the Civil War Museum, Christy Coleman. And Christy, said again, before we start talking about what people did actually in the war, what was going on in terms of the lives of black folks, of African Americans at that time.
Well, the institution of slavery had absolutely spread into all of these new states, and it was trying to spread into new territories. I think one of the biggest fantasies of the pre-war period is this idea that somehow slavery would have faded away or died under its own weight. This is the most flexible labor system the nation had ever known. And because of that, enslaved people were used in every possible enterprise. And it was an extraordinarily lucrative enterprise. So much so that the states that would join the Confederacy had the 6th largest economy in the world at that time. And so there was no, by the time we get to the American Civil War, yes, there's probably about 5 or 6% overall of the African American population that are free peoples living throughout the nation of 35 states. But when war begins, the people who are pressing for black military service, of course, are free black people who are keenly aware of the services that had been rendered by ancestors in previous wars, whether it was the French and Indian War, the free blacks that fought in that, the American Revolutionary War, and so even the War of 1812. Now, here's the thing, when we talk about the necessity of, or the eventuality of using black soldiers, there's another reason why there was concern over having African Americans, particularly enslaved African Americans, fighting. And that is, military service has always been viewed as a marker of masculinity, of manhood. The second thing is, it had always been an opportunity for a young man to rise above his station. So, if you perform admirably on the military field as an enslaved man, you not only have proven your worthiness of equalness, but now you have also have the potential, right, of rising above one's station. And certainly by the American Civil War, white supremacy reigned supreme, North and South. And so this is an issue, right? This is an issue. But when war breaks out, you got people like Frederick Douglass and white allies who are saying, hey, free black community, get down there to the office, because they cannot be drafted. So here's the thing. In the Civil War, African Americans cannot be drafted because they are not considered citizens, even if they are free people over multiple generations.
That's right.
That's right.
Wow.
That's why we have the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment to our Constitution. If you're born here or naturalized here, you are a citizen. Before that, not only were free black people, but a whole lot of immigrant communities were never regarded as citizens of this country, regardless of how long they had been here.
There's a great parallel in the American Revolution. If I can jump in, we have a document on display owned by the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, on display for the first time in the Forgotten Soldier Gallery, that tells the story of a gentleman that we just know as Mulatto Billy. Mulatto Billy was an enslaved, mulatto means biracial. He was enslaved. He, again, took an advantage of gaining possible freedom by joining the British, and he is captured back by his owner, and his owner says, hey, that's treason. You essentially threw your lot in with the enemy, and you are going to hang for this offense. And it's actually Thomas Jefferson, who's governor of Virginia at the time, that intercedes and says, actually, no, as an enslaved individual, Billy has no political agency, no political capital. If you aren't a citizen, then you can't be found guilty of treason. So his life is spared because of that.
If you're just joining us, we're broadcasting live from the American Revolution Museum in Yorktown and having a robust discussion on the often untold story of black soldiers who fought for America despite treatment at home. Our guests include curator of Forgotten Soldier exhibit, Catherine Egner Gruber, American African American history consultant Harvey Bakari, Christy Coleman, CEO of the American Civil War Museum, and Dr. Stephanie Richmond, Associate Professor of History at NSU. And to pick up on your point, Christy, about being able to live above your stature, if you fought in the war. Also, America looked at its war heroes as heroes. I mean, they would have to hold these people up to a higher, or put them on a pedestal, and that would also be a reason why they would not want to have black folks to be able to be in that place.
What's really funny about that is even what's sort of the schizophrenia of the nation. While that is absolutely true, the revolutionary period is one of the struggles, one of the intellectual struggles and contests is who's the rightful heir of the revolutionary period. And so both sides of the divide, political divide, would claim people like Crispus Attucks, which is bizarre, right? But they do. And so, like I said, what ends up happening is that there is a kind of a halt on allowing free blacks to enlist initially, but that will soon pass. It's one of the key elements of the Emancipation Proclamation, which people try to dismiss as not really doing a whole lot. One of the most significant things that it does is allow for the formation of African American regiments and troops for the war. And by war's end, there will be over 200,000 black men who will seize their moment and serve in the United States Navy and in the United States Army. And so that, and their service becomes absolutely critical in several engagements. So that's one element of it. Now, because I don't know if you're going to ask me this or not, but I feel compelled to address it. There is a campaign that has been afoot in the last 10 years or so to suggest that African Americans also served as soldiers in the Confederacy. That is patently false. In fact,
I was going to ask you that, actually, so that's good.
It was patently false. African Americans were impressed and as a requirement of military service, of serving with the Army as carters and truckers and hauling equipment, because it was a requirement of the government that slaveholders provided a male slave of a certain age, for at least 6 months. Officers of the Confederacy often brought with them personal valets, body servants who would also serve. So when Frederick Douglass is writing about the Battle of First Manassas and the rumors about what was seen, they absolutely saw tons of black men coming in with the Confederate Army. They absolutely saw that. But the Confederate government itself, on multiple occasions, goes so far, not only because they recognize what military service means in terms of being a soldier, they absolutely prohibit it. And they prohibit it to the point that on May 1st of 1863, they pass a law saying that any African American, particularly if they're federal, that is a soldier and he is caught, he is not to be treated like any other prisoner of war. He is to be captured and re-enslaved, whether he was a freeman or not prior to service, to have them re-enslaved, or they are to be killed for being in a rebellious state. Now, are you with me? Y'all out there? So it's, I like to kind of knock that out, and I know that there may be some listeners, well, maybe not, this is the traditionally black radio show, right? But there may be some listeners who are like, oh, well, that's not true, because my great-great-granddaddy got a pension and he was black. Well, yeah, some of them absolutely had pension, that received a pension post-war. And those only applied if they had served throughout the war in this capacity and were able to petition, and had a white person
to petition
with them and for them. So that's the fact that they received a pension in no way reflects the fact that they were a soldier. This would continue all the way until finally, at the tail end of this war, in January and February of 1865, The Confederate government is now in deep trouble. And clearly the behavior of what's happening on the federal side, on the United States Army, and the role and the success that they have had with black soldiers, they finally decide that it's, to save the idea of the Confederacy, we'll just go ahead and let them fight. So they do, in fact, establish a regiment that had about 1,000 men that they trained on Capitol Square and at Camp, what would become Camp Lee in Richmond. Those men never saw a single day of battle because Grant will surrender at Appomattox in April.
And the same thing happened in South Carolina during the Revolutionary War. South Carolina was resistant to arming blacks. I mean, I think it was Colonel Loren. He kept going back to the legislature. He said, look, we have to arm them. We have to arm them. The British are arming black people. South Carolina is like, no, we're not doing it.
Too afraid. Yeah. And Stephanie, I saw you nodding your head as Christy was talking.
I get this question every single semester when I teach African American history. Somebody says, there were black Confederates. And I go, no, there were enslaved black men who were forced to serve the Confederate Army. I said, but none of them ever bore arms to support the Confederacy. And I said, I bet if you asked them, they wouldn't have been happy to be there. They would have much rather either stayed home or gone to fight for the Union.
Well, I mean, it's reflective of the million formerly enslaved black people who, in the chaos of war, run off and join the United States Army, men, women, and children. And obviously, right down here in Hampton Roads at Fortress Monroe is where this dynamic begins. That is such a critical moment in history. It is a critical moment. It's Benjamin Butler's brilliance. Even with all of his other drama, Ben Butler is the one, he was a radical Republican of the 1860s. In that not only did he believe that the black man deserved to be free, he also believed he had a right to citizenship and a right to vote. That was radical for the party at that time. And Ben Butler was willing to test his theory when he decided to take advantage of the Confiscation Act. And that changed the world. That changed it all right there.
Absolutely. So after the Civil War, tell me, Stephanie, about the Buffalo Soldiers.
So in the period after the Civil War, right, the United States never stopped fighting against people on our own continent. And we fought a number of wars against Native Americans out on the frontier between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the Spanish-American War. And the African-American soldiers who enlisted either after the Civil War or stayed in during the Civil War, beyond the Civil War, many of them were sent west to fight Native American troops. And so the kind of, I don't know if it's a myth or urban legend, but the story behind the name Buffalo Soldiers comes from these men who went out west or sent out west to defeat Native Americans to take their land and to make the frontier safe for white settlement. And so they said that the Native Americans gave the soldiers these names either because they were as fierce as the buffalo or because their hair was curly like buffalo hair or something, but nobody is really sure exactly where the term came from. And then the Buffalo Soldiers probably get their most well-known historic moment in Cuba in the Spanish-American War, when about 2,000 African-American soldiers were in the Battle of San Juan, including the Army's only black officer, First Lieutenant Charles Young, who was put in charge of the African-American troops at San Juan. And it's actually during the Spanish-American War that the Buffalo Soldiers begin to demand black officers, and that becomes a real rallying point for African-American volunteerism during the Spanish-American War, that they say, because we're going to have black officers, we're willing to join up. And the white generals who are put in charge, to oversee the African-American regiments are told by the War Department that their lieutenants and sergeants are going to be African-American because that's how they can get as much volunteerism as they can. And the U.S. government's really interested in having African-American soldiers because there's this myth that African-Americans were more immune to yellow fever than whites were. We know this is not true here in Hampton Roads. We have yellow fever cemeteries all over the place, but that was the prevailing medical idea at the time. And so Cuba had a major yellow fever epidemic going on in 1898, and white, American soldiers were dying. black and white from yellow fever, as well as from the really intense fighting that happened at the Battle of San Juan.
We have some representatives from the Buffalo Soldiers in the audience. And Lisa? Passing the mic.
Hey, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Jerome Smalls, the Vice President of Hampton Roads Buffalo Soldier Motorcycle Club, and this is some of our members as well. She's absolutely right. The Buffalo Soldiers came about 1866 to 1944. 1866 to 1944. That's when we were most prevalent and when we served the country, right after the Civil War. She's absolutely correct. With mostly all white officers, or we did have African American officers that came later on, as she spoke about previously. One of the first general officers that come out of the Buffalo Soldiers was Benjamin O. Davis, a Brigadier General, retired Air Force. He was the first Buffalo Soldier that got to the rank of Brigadier General. The first West Point graduate was Flipper, Lieutenant Flipper. He was the first West Point graduate from that military academy. Again, thanks for having us, ma'am.
No problem. And your motorcycle group, what do you do?
Absolutely, ma'am. We are the Hampton Roads Motorcycle Club here at Hampton Roads. We try to get back to the community the best we can as responsible motorcycle operators and motorcycle bikers to try to get away from the esteem of what bikers look like. We're professionals, we're soldiers, we're retirees. We run the gamut. We are not a 1% motorcycle club. We are a 99% motorcycle club, which means we are not an outlaw club. We own no properties. We claim no territories.
Okay. So I found this poem that I want to read very, very quickly from Langston Hughes, talking about World War II. Looky here, America, what you done. Let things drift until the riots come. Now your policemen let your mobs run free. I reckon you don't care nothing about me. You tell me that Hitler is a mighty bad man. I guess he took lessons from the Ku Klux Klan. You tell me Mussolini's got an evil heart. Well, it must have been in Beaumont that he had his start. 'Cause everything that Hitler and Mussolini do, Negroes get the same treatment from you. You Jim Crowed me before Hitler rose to power, and you're still Jim Crowing me right now, this very hour. Yet you say we're fighting for democracy, then why don't democracy include me? I ask you this question because I want to know how long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow. And that was written by Langston Hughes, Beaumont to Detroit, 1943. I really want you all from your own perspectives to talk about why did we still, meaning African Americans, why did we still fight? Knowing that in every aspect of all of these wars, there was still a country that either didn't see us as citizens, didn't see us as human, as we got further along, didn't see us as worthy of anything other than to die on the battlefield, yet we were still there.
Because we
Krista Coleman.
we believe fervently in the promise of America. That is why. And it is, as another poem says, I've always loved America, but America don't love me. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, it's the promise of life and liberty and pursuit of happiness, that all men are created equal. That if I can pursue and follow my American dream despite the fact that there are all of these realities in front of me. I mean, that's why they do it. They see it as an opportunity to serve and to prove and to force this nation to live up to her ideals. And I think that is what is astonishing to me, and what I think people fail to understand, is that marginalized communities who choose military service, that they are by far, in my mind, the most worthy of the name hero, because they do it and they do it and they do it and they do it. Some of them even murdered when they get home because they're wearing a uniform.
Yeah.
And that's the part that we don't, that was happening. When they come home and they've had on a uniform, they were hung and murdered in those uniforms.
Absolutely.
So we can't, that's why they do it. The bottom line is that's why they do it, and will continue to do it, to offer their service, because at the end of the day, a whole lot of black folk and brown folk and everybody else loves what we should be.
And that's through time, there was also the African American community was not monolithic. There were some who were optimistic about fighting in World War I, World War II. The optimism was once we served, we would prove our citizenship and that we're worthy of being citizens. So after World War I, the worst race riots, a time period called Red Summer, Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1934, many of those
Cleveland.
communities, Detroit, Cleveland, all throughout the Americas, not just the South, because African Americans fighting for democracy was in opposition to white supremacy's view of America and democracy. Recognizing black soldiers goes against the idea of this is a white man's country. And so once those soldiers came back from World War I, and a significant point about World War I, that was probably the largest amount of black men to leave the United States since the slave trade and going overseas. They encounter white women who they have access to, which they don't have access to without being lynched in the Americas. And when they come back, many whites who believe in separate but equal America said, we have to put them back in their place. That's why soldiers were, as she mentioned, were lynched in their uniform. And I can say for myself personally, I'm a military brat, which means, of course, my father was in the Army. And he went into the Korean War when the military was integrated. And despite the fact that he fought in Korea, Okinawa, later on he would do 2 tours in Vietnam, and he was exposed to Agent Orange and died at a young age after he retired. But we lived in the South all of our lives, and we would drive from Virginia or Wilmington to Texas. And I always remember my mother, she would, as we prepared to drive down south, she'd make cornbread, sweet potato salad, fried chicken, and my father would bring his 1910 Mauser 635 hand pistol. And we couldn't stop in hotels. We didn't have a green book. So our rest stop, our hotel was the rest stop. And we would sit back in the back of our electric 225. And the seats were kind of laid out, right?
Yep.
And me and my 3 siblings, we would lay back in the back. My mom, feed us food. And then when my dad thought we were asleep, he would reach over to the glove compartment, pull out that 1910 hand pistol, put the magazine in, put it right under his seat, put a crack in the window, and take his nap. But as children, we never knew the dangers we were in. We had to go through Mobile, Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama, Biloxi, Mississippi, a black family driving.
Yeah.
So, and so I was able to see and understand later in life by understanding history, I was able to see what he was able to do as a soldier. He was going to protect his family. Yeah, he would fight in Korea, he'd fight in Vietnam, but he's going to protect his family right here in the United States.
Absolutely. Stephanie, go ahead.
So one of the things I actually do when I teach military history is I have my students write short biographies of African American World War I veterans, because there's a wonderful resource at the Library of Virginia where the state of Virginia surveyed all of the veterans who came home from World War I, including African American veterans, and those documents have been scanned and put on the Library of Virginia's website. And so when I was setting the project up, I did one history myself to kind of try it out. And so the person I just picked kind of at random off the list was this man named John Bernard Brewer, who was from Norfolk. He grew up here in Hampton Roads. He went to Howard. He became a dentist. This was not a man who needed to enlist. But he did. In 1917, he enlisted in the medical division. He served. He was promoted to sergeant. He served under General Pershing in Europe. And he was cited for bravery at I'm going to butcher this, Alette River, the Battle of Alette River, because he, as a medical corpsman, rescued people who had been injured on the front. He was discharged at the end of the war and came home, and he was admitted to Northwestern, got a bachelor's degree in accounting, owned an accounting firm in Chicago, and was set up for a really successful life. Unfortunately, he got into a car accident in 1930, and he spent the rest of his life living in VA hospitals and died in 1943 in Hampton. But we know a decent amount about his life because his family were kind of middle class. And so the Journal and Guide wrote articles about the social goings on. And so there's articles about his mother going to visit him in the hospital, about when he came back, and talking about the importance of his service, because this is a pretty well-off young man who didn't have to enlist.
And he served anyway.
And he served anyway.
Back to Christy's point. So Normandy, since it just happened, the 75th anniversary, still today there was a disconnect in terms of the service that black soldiers played, that they were actually on the beach, that they rescued people, that they did things. And I don't know if you all saw the story of the widow in Maryland who is 90 years old now, and she's still fighting to get her husband's medal and to have him recognized. Will there come a day where we can tell the full story? Well, let me start with Kate, because she's been immersed in trying to work on this.
Absolutely, and I think that we're having this conversation in a museum, and I think that's an important point to make. Is remember where we are right now, because all of us on the panel can probably speak to this as well. That I think if we're talking about being inclusive, telling inclusive stories, museums are the places to do that. Exhibitions like Forgotten Soldier, Christie's new museum in Richmond, Colonial Williamsburg for sure. These are the places where people should be able to come together and have productive conversations about the past and what the implications of the past have for our not only our present but our future as well. I think that we're at a critical moment in our history to come together and tell these inclusive stories. I know at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation here, we try very hard to tell stories of people in the past that a modern audience can really resonate with. We want you to come into our museum and learn stories about people just like you and me. We say that we tell stories of ordinary people who lived in an extraordinary time. These are all extraordinary times that we're speaking of, and we're talking about ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and really had to leverage opportunities without the benefit of the hindsight we have today. I think that's true whether we're talking about the Revolution, whether we're talking about the Civil War, World War I, what have you. But I think it's important to say that museums are or should be safe places to have these conversations, even if that means complicating the history that we thought we knew.
Christy.
I would agree with that. The two most trusted institutions that Americans claim are the two most trusted institutions from study after study after study are libraries and museums.
And PBS.
And PBS.
And NPR.
So, and the reason is because the material is there to support what's being said. And I think we are finally reaching a space where the histories that are displayed, the art that is displayed, that all of it is reflective of who we are, right? I tell people all the time when they say, oh, you guys are just revising history. Like, well, you just really don't understand how history works, do you? We're in a constant state of revision as new information or new evidence comes into the fore, as new questions come to the fore. So here's the thing. It's the story of us. And the best example I can give you that I've used lately is imagine how different our questions are if we look at our history not as a form of indoctrination, but a form of helping us with critical thinking about the times we're living in. And I say that because indoctrination told us that George Washington had wooden teeth, which was patently false. George Washington had teeth that came from human beings, enslaved human beings, and also from ivory. We would have had a completely different conversation if we had grown up knowing that particular fact. So my point is, and don't get me wrong, I think Washington's cool, right? More or less. And but that's the general thing. I think we have We have to seize our moments, and I am particular about using temporary exhibitions to dig deeper, but not for your first input. If it's not, this idea of inclusivity to me is really, we have to be mindful that what we're really looking for is a complete narrative. That's something entirely different. And so if you're looking at it through the multiple lenses of people who lived an experience, it's a far richer and a far more nuanced past. And it's a usable past.
Harvey, we got 2 minutes left.
I think also with education comes a little bit of adjusting, as the artist Titus Gafar, who has an exhibit here, has two pieces in the exhibit here, as he would say, changing your gaze. And it has to do with this idea of perception of words. For instance, if I say to you that at the time of the revolution that African Americans were 20% of the population, you might think, oh, they're insignificant. Well, but if I say to you, where's the founding fathers? Who's the founding father of the country? George Washington. Who's the founding father of the Constitution? James Madison. Who's the founding father of the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Jefferson. Where did they all live? Virginia. And in Virginia, they were 42% of the population. And in counties where all those founding fathers lived, when they were being raised, they had black hands touching their bodies. Some of them may have been raised on the breasts of black women. So so when they're writing these documents and they're considering their world, they're not looking at 20%. They're looking at that 42% or 60% in certain counties. That's the reality. So instead of thinking of African Americans as an insignificant part, once you put it in its proper context, you'll see how significant their presence were.
And Stephanie, you get the last 30 seconds.
Okay. I would say the one thing we also need to think about is diversity in our classrooms. As I'm sitting here, we have a great panel, but it dawned on me, I don't think I had a female history professor until college. I didn't have a black history professor until college. And so my real goal in the classroom is to send my students out, whether they're going to be teachers or not, to represent a great diversity of people in the classroom and in their communities who can speak intelligently and passionately about history.
Dr. Stephanie Richmond, it's Christy Coleman, Harvey Bakari, and Catherine Gruber. Let's give them all a round of applause. Thank you so much, our panel. And before we wrap things up today, let me tell you about a film presentation that you will not want to miss. On Tuesday, July 9th at 7:15, the Narrow Cinema in Ghent, Norfolk, presents Toni Morrison, The Pieces I Am. There will be a film introduction and a post-film discussion on the life of this prolific writer. For more information, go to narrowcinema.com. And while you're online, hop on over to anotherviewradio.org and download your favorite podcast. And sign up for our eView newsletter. It's a once-a-week reminder of upcoming shows. We're on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter at Barbara Ham Lee. Next week, the Another View crew takes a break for the 4th of July holiday, and we wish you a safe and joy-filled weekend. In our place is the show American Anthem, The Special, the creation, popularization, and evolution of a selection of songs about our shared identities as Americans. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley produced today's On the Road production and did a fabulous job. Thank you, Lisa. Special thanks to Todd Washburn, Ray Lenz, and Victor Bowen for making us sound so good outside the studio. And a very, very special thank you to our live audience for the tour, who will take a tour now of the exhibit. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Thank you so very, very much for listening to Another View.